The world felt different on my recital day. It was like all the colors were brighter, the air fizzed with invisible sparks, and my heart had grown little wings. The reason for all this magic was hanging on my bedroom door. My costume. It was the most beautiful dress I had ever seen, or could ever imagine. The skirt was made of layers and layers of scratchy, stiff tulle, the color of a summer sky just before the sun says goodnight. Mommy called it dusk blue. Tiny silver sparkles were scattered all over it, like a million captured stars that glittered and flashed every time I dared to twirl in front of the long mirror. Even though the fabric tickled my arms and neck, I didn't mind one bit. It was the price of being beautiful. Mommy had spent the entire morning turning me into a real ballerina. "Stand still, little wiggle worm," she'd say, her fingers working skillfully to pull my hair back into a bun so tight it felt like it was lifting my eyebrows. She secured it with a dozen pins that pricked my scalp, but when she placed a little crown of fake pearls around it, the pinching feeling vanished. I stared at the girl in the mirror. She looked serious, professional. She looked like a dancer. Every time I caught my reflection, my tummy did a little flip-flop, a mix of bubbling excitement and a tiny drop of fear. The most important part of the day, though, happened not in a sparkly dress, but in my pajamas at the breakfast table. The kitchen smelled like toast and coffee, the usual morning rush sounds filling the air. Daddy was already half out the door, his work bag slung over his shoulder and his tie still undone around his neck. He was about to leave when he saw me, a small statue of anticipation by the table, and he stopped. Everything about him stopped. He put his bag down, walked back, and knelt so his eyes were level with mine. A big, genuine smile spread across his face, the kind that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Well now, look at my little ballerina," he said, his voice a soft, warm rumble that made me feel safe. "You look like a star, Chloe. A real-life star." My voice came out as a tiny whisper, afraid to break the spell of the moment. "You're coming, right, Daddy? You promised you would?" He didn't even hesitate. He held out his thick pinky finger, crooked and waiting. "I will be there," he said, his tone serious and sure. "A very important man from a very big company is coming to the office, and I have to be there for the meeting. But the second it's over, I'm flying out of there. I wouldn't miss your dance for the whole wide world." We hooked our pinkies together, squeezing tight. A pinky promise. The most sacred, unbreakable seal. It was more powerful than any grown-up signature. "I have the ticket right here," he added, pulling his worn leather wallet from his pocket. He flipped it open and showed me the crisp paper ticket, with row C, seat 12 printed in black ink. The third row a little to the left. He let me touch it. It felt real, solid, a guarantee. That promise became a big, warm hug that I carried inside me all day long. When we got to the theater, the feeling only grew. The air backstage smelled like a strange perfume of hairspray, sweat, and old, dusty velvet curtains. A crowd of other girls, all in their own versions of sparkly, colorful costumes, buzzed around like little bees in a frantic, glittering hive. Their parents were there, fussing over them, adjusting straps, whispering, "Good luck," and "You'll be great." Mommy gave me one last tight squeeze and a raspberry kiss on my forehead before she had to go find her seat. "You look perfect," she whispered. "Your daddy will be here any minute, I'm sure of it." I nodded, my heart thumping a happy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. Ms. Anya, our teacher with the long legs and the Russian accent, clapped her hands sharply. "5 minutes, my little dancers. Places." We all lined up behind the heavy red curtain, our ballet slippers making soft, anxious tapping sounds on the worn wooden floor. I was number 4 in line. My turn came so fast. One moment I was in the dim wing, the next I was walking into a blinding blaze of light. It was so bright and warm on my face that for a second I couldn't see anything but a big, dark, breathing space filled with shadows. Then my eyes adjusted. I could see the rows of faces, hundreds of them, all turned toward me. I found Mommy right away. She was in the 5th row, not the 3rd, but she was smiling and holding her phone up to record me. My eyes darted to where Daddy was supposed to be. Row C, seat 12. The seat was empty. A dark, hollow square of plush red velvet. My breath caught in my throat, a tiny, sharp gasp, but I pushed the worry down, down, down into my slippers. The music started, that soft, familiar piano song we had practiced 1,000 times. I told myself a story in my head. He was just late. That very important man was probably talking too much. Daddy was just parking the car. He was running down the street right now. He would slip in quietly, and the next time I looked, he'd be there. So I danced. I poured every single bit of my heart into my steps. I remembered to point my toes until they ached. I remembered to keep my arms graceful and soft, like they were floating on water. And I remembered to smile, 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 even when my lips started to feel stiff. Every leap felt like I was trying to fly high enough to see the front door of the theater. Every twirl was a signal, a little, "Here I am," just for him. Through the whole song, I kept sneaking little, hopeful glances at that empty chair. It stared back at me, a dark, lonely hole in a sea of smiling faces. The song came to its gentle end, and I held my final pose, my arms outstretched, my chest heaving up and down. The sound of applause was like a big wave of ocean noise washing over me. I took my bow, my eyes desperately scanning the crowd one last time, my smile now a mask I was struggling to hold in place. The seat was still empty. As soon as I was back behind the heavy curtain, the world became a noisy, happy mess. Girls were giggling and hugging each other, their faces flushed with excitement. The air was thick with the sweet smell of roses and carnations. Dads were lifting their daughters into the air, spinning them around, their proud laughter booming through the cramped space. "You were wonderful, sweetheart. My perfect little star." The words floated around me, but none of them were for me. I stood near the edge of the wing, my sparkly costume suddenly feeling heavy and dull, and scanned the crowd of grown-ups for my dad's face. I looked for his dark hair, his kind eyes, the blue shirt he said he would wear. He wasn't there. Mommy finally pushed through the crowd, her smile a little too bright, a little too tight. "Oh, Chloe, honey, you were magnificent. Absolutely perfect." She wrapped me in a hug, but it felt different from her usual hugs. It felt like she was trying to hold me together. "I am so proud of you." "Did you see him?" I asked, my voice small. "Is Daddy here?" Her smile faltered for just a second. She glanced around, as if maybe he was hiding behind a curtain. "I'm sure he got held up, sweetie. That meeting must have been incredibly important. You know how it is. He's going to be so heartbroken that he missed it. He was looking forward to it all week." She kept talking, her words smoothing over the empty space where my dad should have been, but it was like trying to put a blanket over a hole. The hole was still there. We went to the dressing room, a loud, steamy room full of girls chattering and changing. Bouquets of flowers were everywhere, sitting on benches and spilling out of bags. A girl named Sarah had a big bunch of pink roses from her dad. Another girl, Emily, was showing everyone a small, shiny charm bracelet her parents had given her. I slowly, carefully took the pearl crown out of my hair and began to pull the pins from my bun, my fingers clumsy. Mommy helped me unzip the beautiful dusk blue dress. As I stepped out of it, it was just a pile of sparkly fabric on the floor. The magic was gone. I put on my regular clothes, a soft t-shirt and leggings, which felt strange against my skin now. It felt like giving up. The car ride home was quiet. Mommy tried to make it cheerful. She put on the radio, and a happy pop song filled the car, but the singer sounded like she was shouting from far away. I just stared out the window, watching the streetlights smear into long yellow streaks as we drove. Each car that passed us, I would peer inside, hoping to see my dad's car, hoping he was on his way home too, but none of them were his. When we pulled into our driveway, the house was dark. Daddy's car wasn't there. A new kind of hope, a smaller, more desperate kind, had been whispering to me that he might have come straight home to wait for me, maybe with a surprise. But the empty driveway was a silent answer. The house was asleep. Mommy unlocked the door and turned on the hall light. "All right, sleepyhead, let's get you ready for bed," she said, her voice gentle. But I couldn't. I couldn't take off the costume. It felt like breaking the last piece of the promise. I had worn it for him. He needed to see me in it. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I'm going to wait for him." I walked over to the big armchair by the front window, the one he always sat in to read the newspaper, and I climbed onto it. I tucked the scratchy tool of my skirt underneath my legs and sat there, straight and tall, like a little soldier on guard duty. From there, I could see the whole street. "Chloe, honey, it's late. You have to sleep," Mommy said, her voice tired. She knelt beside the chair. "He might be very, very late. The meeting could have gone on for hours, and then maybe they all went for dinner." "He'll come," I said, my eyes fixed on the dark street outside. "He pinky promised." She sighed, a long, sad sound. She knew she couldn't win against a pinky promise. She brought me a glass of water and my favorite blanket, the soft one with the cartoon cats on it. She draped it over my shoulders. "Okay," she whispered, "but just a little while." She kissed my head and went upstairs. I heard the water run for her shower and then the quiet click of her bedroom door. The house grew still, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the loud, slow tick-tock of the big clock in the hallway. Tick-tock. Each sound was a second passing. Each second was a moment he wasn't there. I watched the clock. 8 o'clock became 9. The last of the dog walkers went by. 9 o'clock became 10. The lights in the neighbors' houses went out, one by one, until our street was a row of dark, sleeping boxes. My eyelids felt heavy, like little weights were attached to them, but I forced them open. I had to be awake when he pulled into the driveway. I had to be there to run to the door. So I waited, my face pressed against the cool glass of the window in my beautiful, scratchy costume, until the numbers on the clock turned to 10, then 11, and then, finally, to the lonely, quiet hour of 12 a.m. The world goes quiet after midnight. It's a different kind of quiet than daytime quiet. It's heavy. It presses in on you. The only sound in the whole house was the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a tiny hammer hitting my heart, each tock a second longer that he wasn't home. I had started to play a game to stay awake, counting the ticks. I got all the way to 364 before I lost count and had to start over. My beautiful dusk blue costume, which had felt so light and magical hours ago, now felt like it was made of lead. The sparkles had stopped sparkling in the dim light of the street lamp outside, and the tulle just felt scratchy and annoying against my tired skin. I rested my forehead against the cold window pane. The glass was cool and smooth, and it fogged up with my breath. I would draw sad faces in the fog, and then wipe them away, just to have something to do. I must have drifted off for a few minutes, my head slumped against the arm of the big chair, because a sudden sweep of headlights across the living room wall made me jump. My heart leaped into my throat. A car door slammed shut. This was it. He was here. I scrambled off the chair, my legs stiff and tingly from sitting for so long. The tulle of my skirt caught on the corner of the coffee table, and I had to yank it free. I ran to the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, waiting for the familiar sound of his keys in the lock. I held my breath. I wanted him to see me right away, standing here waiting for him in my costume. He would see me, and he would drop his bag, and he would sweep me up in a huge hug and say how sorry he was and how beautiful I looked. The key turned. The door swung open, and Daddy stumbled in. He didn't look like my daddy. His tie was gone, his shirt was untucked and wrinkled, and his hair, usually so perfect, was a mess. He smelled different, too. Not like coffee and soap, but like something sharp and smoky and strange. He looked tired. So tired. His eyes were heavy and a little bit red. He flicked on the main light and blinked hard, like the brightness hurt him. He didn't see me at first. He just dropped his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud and let out a long, groaning sigh. "Daddy?" I said, my voice a tiny, hopeful squeak. He finally looked down and his eyes widened. For a second, he just stared, a confused look on his face. "Chloe? What in the world are you doing up?" It's the middle of the night." The words I had practiced in my head. The happy, "You're home!" I wanted to shout. They all got stuck in my throat. All that came out was a choked whisper. "I waited for you." His face changed then. The confusion melted away and something else replaced it. Something that looked like a storm cloud. "Waited for me? Honey, you should have been in bed hours ago." He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his eyes. Long day. Really long day. He started to walk past me toward the kitchen. He hadn't said it. He hadn't said anything about my dress. He hadn't said anything about the recital. It was like it never even happened. "You didn't come," I said, my voice a little louder now, trembling. I stood there, a small, sparkly statue of a broken promise. He stopped, his back to me. He let out another sigh, but this one sounded different. It sounded angry. "Chloe, not tonight. I'm exhausted. The meeting, it was a disaster. Everything that could have gone wrong, went wrong. But you pinky promised," I insisted, the words hot with tears that were finally starting to well up in my eyes. "You promised you would be there." He turned around slowly, and the look on his face made me take a step back. He wasn't smiling. "I know I promised, I know. But things happen. Real life happens. Sometimes we can't do the things we want to do. I have a job, Chloe, a very important job that pays for this house and for that costume you're wearing. It pays for your ballet lessons. You have to understand that." His voice got louder with every word. He wasn't yelling at me, not really, but the sound of it was big and scary in the quiet house. A light flicked on at the top of the stairs. Mommy stood there in her bathrobe, her face pale with sleep and worry. "Robert?" she called down, her voice sharp. What's going on? Daddy looked up at her, then back down at me. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving him looking deflated and sad. I'm sorry, he mumbled, not looking at me. I'm sorry, Chloe, I really am. I couldn't. He walked away then, into the kitchen, and I heard the refrigerator door open. I stood there in the bright, harsh light of the hallway, the tears finally spilling over and rolling down my cheeks, leaving hot, wet tracks. I looked down at the beautiful dusk blue dress, at the sparkles that didn't shine. It didn't feel like a ballerina's dress anymore. It just felt like a silly costume. The pinky promise was broken. It lay in pieces on the floor between us, and I knew with a certainty that made my small body ache that no amount of sorries could ever put it back together again. I didn't cry anymore after that. The tears just stopped, like a faucet being turned off. I stood there, watching my father's silhouette move in the bright light of the kitchen, and felt a cold, heavy stillness settle inside me. Mommy came down the stairs, her slippers making soft shuffling sounds on the wood. She gently took my hand. Come on, sweet pea, she whispered, her voice thick with a sadness that matched my own. Let's get you to bed. She led me upstairs to my room. Wordlessly, she helped me take off the dress. This time, I didn't care if the tulle ripped or if sparkles fell off onto the carpet. It wasn't a magical dress anymore. It was just a thing. A costume for a part I didn't want to play. Mommy hung it carefully in my closet, but I wished she had just thrown it on the floor. I put on my pajamas, climbed into bed, and turned to face the wall. She tucked the covers around me and kissed my hair. He loves you so much, Chloe, she said softly. He has a lot on his mind. I didn't answer. I just lay there, perfectly still, listening to her sigh and quietly close my door. The house was filled with a new kind of silence, one that was heavier than before, filled with all the words that hadn't been said. The next morning, Daddy's car was gone before I woke up. A plate of my favorite pancakes was on the table, with a smiley face made of chocolate chips, but I just pushed them around with my fork. Everything felt different. The air in our house was thick and hard to breathe. When Daddy came home that evening, he brought me a present. It was a beautiful, expensive-looking doll, a ballerina with a porcelain face and a dress almost exactly like mine. He handed it to me with a hopeful look in his eyes. I'm sorry, Button, he said, his voice quiet. I took the doll and said, thank you, but I didn't play with it. I put it on the shelf in my room and it just sat there, another silent reminder. I went to one more ballet class the next week. Ms. Anya was full of praise for my performance. But when the piano music started, the song that had once filled me with so much joy, all I could feel was the hollow space of that empty chair in the third row. My feet felt like they were made of stone. When I came home, I told Mommy I didn't want to go to ballet anymore. She tried to talk me out of it, but her heart wasn't in it. I think she understood. The girl who loved to dance had left the stage that night and never came back. Years passed. Life moved on, as it always does. The memory of that night faded, not disappearing completely, but softening around the edges, like an old photograph. It became a story I kept packed away. My father and I were fine. We loved each other. He came to my soccer games and my high school graduation. He was a good dad, but there was always a tiny, invisible wall between us, built from the bricks of that one broken promise. It wasn't until I was 18, packing up my room to leave for college, that the wall finally began to crumble. I was on a stool, reaching for a box on the top shelf of my closet, when my fingers brushed against something stiff and familiar. I pulled it down. It was the dusk blue costume. It looked so small now, a relic from a life I barely remembered. Tucked into a fold of the tulle was the little crown of fake pearls, now yellowed with age. I didn't know he was there until he spoke, his voice startling me. I never thought you kept that. My dad was standing in the doorway, his hair now more gray than dark, the lines around his eyes deeper. He looked at the dress, then at me, and his face was filled with a gentle, profound sadness. I didn't know I did either, I admitted, my voice quiet. He walked into the room and sat on the edge of my childhood bed. He was quiet for a long time, just looking at the dress in my hands. I was so ashamed that night, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. That meeting, the one I told you about? It wasn't just a meeting, it was everything. I was up for a promotion, a big one, and that client, losing them meant I wouldn't get it. It meant I had failed, and I did. I failed spectacularly. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw not the angry, stumbling man who came home that night, but a man who was hurting. I sat in my car for an hour after it was over, just trying to figure out how to come home. My whole world had just fallen apart, and I knew you were waiting for me, in your perfect little world, in your perfect little dress. And I felt like a fraud. I couldn't stand the thought of you seeing me like that. A failure. So I went out with my boss, and I had a drink, and then another. I was just running away. It was cowardly, and it was the biggest regret of my life. He reached into his wallet, the same worn leather one from all those years ago, and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was creased and soft from time. He unfolded it. It was the ticket. Row C, seat 12. I've kept it all these years, he whispered, to remind myself of the man I never want to be again. And in that moment, sitting in my childhood room with the tiny, sparkly dress between us, the last brick in that invisible wall turned to dust. I finally understood. It was never about me. It was about his pain. It was about the messy, complicated, and sometimes heartbreaking reality of being a grown-up. The 9-year-old girl inside me who had waited by the window finally understood. He hadn't broken his promise because he didn't love me. He had broken it because he was human. My love for him had always been the simple, trusting love of a child. But in that moment, it changed into something deeper, something stronger. It became the understanding love of an adult. I went to him, sat beside him, and for the first time, I was the one who put my arm around him. The pinky promise was still broken, but it no longer mattered. We had found something far more real to put in its place. Life is not made of perfect moments, but of how we pick up the pieces when things fall apart. It's in the messy, difficult, and honest conversations that we find the deepest connections and the truest forms of love. It's a reminder that beneath every mistake, there is a story of human struggle, a story of someone trying their best, even when their best isn't good enough. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of forgiveness and understanding.